So you wanna get right to the core. So you wanna know what it's all for. So you wanna come off knowing more. Well, you better get hip. The podcast by George. So you wanna get straight to the show. So you wanna know what you need to know. You wanna know what we're all here for. Well, you better get hip. The podcast by George. Podcast by George. Podcast by George. He knows what he's fighting for. It's podcast by George. Podcast by George. Wanna know what we're fighting for?
Hello, hi, how are you? Welcome back into another podcast by George. Big topic today, big news, really important. It has to do with Julian Assange. We've talked about that on the podcast before, and joining us on the podcast by George live line again, down in Florida, Dr. Jasmine McNealy. She's following the Assange trial, and I want to read this brief little bio. Dr. McNealy is a scholar of media and technology. She's got a view towards influencing law and policy. She's an associate professor in the Department of Communications down there at the University of Florida's College of Journalism and Communications. She earned a PhD in mass communication and a JD at the University of Florida and a BS in both journalism and Afro-American studies at the University of Wisconsin. I love reading that bio. It always reminds me of the day that I graduated from J school, that I got my bachelor's degree. I sat in my car, I think I about wept. I'll never take another class as long as I live, and I never did. And here's somebody that's gone on to such higher education, it's just hard for me to believe. Dr. McNealy, welcome back to a podcast by George.
Thank you, and thank you for having me.
Well, you know, I love talking to you, but I hate hearing the news coming out of London with Assange. We had talked last time that that extradition hearing was getting ready to begin last time we talked, and it's underway now. And I think it was George Conway, the commentator that I saw, saying that if to call it a kangaroo court would be an insult to kangaroos. And I thought, that's kind of the way that I looked. I can't believe what's going on out there. Now, I'm not that familiar with the British court system, obviously. I didn't even know about the Old Bailey or whatever they call it. But here's Assange ready to go into this hearing, and they introduce a bunch of new evidence. They expand the charges against him to include all this espionage stuff. A lot of people thought he had a pretty good chance, maybe beforehand, based on what was alleged against him, maybe to walk out of there. But these new charges really make people believe that there isn't much of a way that he can get out of this thing. And so that's kind of a long-winded intro by me, but I guess your take basically on where he stands right now and what's been transpiring here, maybe in the first week of the hearing there in London.
Yeah, so it's supposed to be a around 4-week extradition trial to see whether UK officials will allow him to be transported back to the United States for trial based on the many charges he's been charged against. And I think the people who were saying they thought he had a good chance of beating it before the extra charges, I think they're correct. The first wave of charges were really publication-based charges. What I mean by publication-based is they're based on the fact that he distributed this information, that WikiLeaks published this information, which in the United States and in the UK as well has this tradition. But freedom of speech, the First Amendment in the United States protects publication of information, particularly truthful information. And so he was reporting or engaged in journalistic activities, but more than that, he was involved in activity that was central to the First Amendment, which is publication. It's the press kind of clause in the First Amendment, right? So many people could see, you know what, we've had many cases at the Supreme Court level in the United States wherein the court has said, hey, we're not going to punish publication, even if it's the punishment of information that was unlawfully acquired, if the person publishing it is not involved in the unlawful acquisition, right? You can punish someone for behavior. You can't punish them for distributing information or for speaking. The second wave of charges or charge is actually based on the US government claiming that Assange encouraged hackers to hack into these different strategic sites. There we have actual activity, criminal activity, which has no protection under the First Amendment, right?
And the hacking element.
The hacking element, right? So that's pure activity, which is not, protected under the First Amendment. We've had, again, case law in the United States saying basically pure activity, particularly criminal activity, is not free expression as protected under the First Amendment.
Well, and it seems complicated sometimes. Sometimes it isn't very complicated. This is just a common man's interpretation of WikiLeaks and Julian Assange. Okay, Julian Assange, he starts WikiLeaks. He has it. Well, what is WikiLeaks? Well, WikiLeaks to me is like a big drop box. As a matter of fact, it was pretty similar to that. He said, if you want to leak something, drop it in here. It's protected. Your identity will not be revealed, and we'll publish it. And we won't massage it. We won't report it. We'll just throw it out there. That's a little bit of a problem in a lot of people's minds because it was, pretty much just a bulk drop and people could interpret it any way that they wanted to. The man has no friends. He's done this with every government around the globe, mostly, and including the nation that he's from, Australia. But he did it with the United States. He's got no friends here. I mean, he did it... that stuff that got released from the DNC, those emails, John Podesta's emails, that appeared in his Dropbox, and it got released. Man, they hate his guts and livers. They blame him for the loss of the election for Hillary Clinton because that stuff was highly embarrassing. Okay, Donald Trump ought to love the guy, right? It made him president. No, Donald Trump doesn't like Julian Assange because in his Dropbox for WikiLeaks appeared tax returns. Assange called on people to provide them to him. He put that out there, makes Trump look bad, makes Trump mad. Trump doesn't like him. The only category of people that ought to like this guy, as far as I'm concerned, are journalists. I mean, because if they convict this man, if he gets extradited to the United States and they find him guilty of what he's accused of, every major political reporter viewing classified information in this country and around the globe, because remember, Assange isn't a U.S. citizen. The United States is reaching out around the world to grab him and pull him back into this country. They're all at risk. They're all at danger. Journalists ought to be lining up behind this guy, but very few are. I am. I know you're alarmed and concerned about it, obviously, but why aren't journalists more alarmed about this? Well, I got some criticism of the journalistic community for you folks. They're relying on the people whispering in their ears to their sources, to their access that they have, and you'll see it nightly on the cable news networks. They don't need to do what Julian Assange is doing. That's not the kind of reporting, the kind of biased reporting that they do doesn't require that kind of journalism. So they're not wanting to support the guy, and I don't think they're jealous or envious of him, but they're just not supportive. So I'm looking at Julian Assange and I'm thinking, my God, somebody has got to shed some light on this. They've got to try to help this guy out just by getting the word out. And so that's what we're trying to do here today. I'm probably most concerned about these additional charges and what they mean for journalism in general. I'm concerned about Julian Assange personally also, but is that the primary concern that you have also, what this could portend for the journalistic community?
So an important thing, it is important to consider what the impact could be on the press or the organized news organizations, right? Particularly if they receive information from a source that leaks it in its document form, and what happens then when they distribute that information. But in the United States, anybody could be the press, technically, right? We don't have a set definition. We don't license journalists.
We're all journalists.
It could impact anybody who gets some information and decides to post it. And it's not just federal government information, but all different kinds of information that people come across or is given to them or they find that they want to bring attention to. So anybody using their medium, right? So the kind of popular blog-ish site that people are using now to express themselves. Like anybody
Podcast by George.
Podcast by George, right? Or any podcast, right? That people use to distribute information could be implicated by any movement in this case towards prosecuting him. Talking about that information, but also how they're interpreting this new charge. Like, did he encourage criminal activity? Was it integral to a criminal act? And I think that's really important to watch and how the courts are interpreting that.
Well, and that really is key. It all has to do with the act. It has to do with the hacking, because encouraging a source or a leaker to bring information forward, even assisting them in doing that, that's always been allowed. That's not illegal. It's the what is illegal, though, is like breaking into things and stealing, hacking, those types of activities. Mm-hmm. And a really poignant example of that was on trial this week in London. Daniel Ellsberg from the Pentagon Papers, the guy that revealed that information in 1971 that was published by the New York Times, the Washington Post, and others, was there to say it's the same thing. I mean, Julian Assange to him is a kindred spirit. He's a publisher. Daniel Ellsberg was a leaker. He was a Chelsea Manning. He was an Eric Snowden. He was that kind of a person, and he hastened the end of the Vietnam War, did untold good for the country and the world at large by revealing this stuff in 1971, and people like him would be prevented from doing this, and Assange and journalists would be prevented from publishing it because they could go to prison for life. Some of these espionage charges, I thought originally you could be executed for, but maybe that's a little far out there. But you definitely, the cumulative charges could result in Assange being in jail for life. And like I said, I thought Ellsberg, his testimony was very interesting. What do you think of Ellsberg's appearance in London?
Well, I mean, it's not shocking. I think since the beginning of the WikiLeaks drama, which it's been quite a while. It's been several years, almost coming up on almost a decade, dealing with WikiLeaks with respect to Chelsea Manning, and now actual prosecution of Julian, or attempted prosecution of Julian Assange. And Ellsberg has kind of said from the beginning, look, this is no different than his case. Way back when, because he sees, I think he sees the importance of holding government accountable, not necessarily engaging in criminal activity, but that there is value even with this unlawfully acquired information. And also, what are the ramifications of allowing certain behavior by government to continue without the public being aware of it? So I think Ellsberg thinks from a public good standpoint, a public interest standpoint, and from the standpoint of like some of our older theories of why we want people to be able to publish any kind of information they get, and that is the idea that people need to be able to govern themselves, and the only way to do that is if they're informed, or at least have a way to inform themselves. That doesn't include necessarily criminal activity, but if the information is made available, then we allow that information to be available, and we don't punish the publisher of the information for making it available.
As the Washington Post and the New York Times did in the Ellsberg leak. And the other part about it is they've all released WikiLeaks information. That stuff has been published by those major, not just Julian Assange. A lot of the information that was within WikiLeaks has now been put into the public domain. It's appeared in WAPO, New York Times, The Guardian, the LA Times, all of these various places. Right. So, I mean, and if you extend this to its furthest extent, they could all end up in a courtroom in London. Well, we're running out of time. I just again wanted to shed a little bit more light on this. I want to, and the good doctor here could bear with me. I wanted to read this real quickly. This is just a couple of paragraphs. Now, this is from Jonathan Cook. He's an award-winning journalist. He's based in the Middle East, and I'm going to spin through this real quick. But I thought this was an outstanding summary. It says, And it's entitled The Death of Journalism. Right now, every journalist in the world ought to be up in arms, protesting at the abuses Assange is suffering and has suffered, and the fate he will endure if extradition is approved. They should be protesting on front pages and in TV news stories against the endless and blatant abuses of legal process at Assange's hearings in the British courts, including the gross conflict of interest of Lady Emma Arbuthnot, I think her name is, the judge overseeing his case. They should be in an uproar at the surveillance the CIA illegally arranged inside the Ecuadorian embassy while Assange was confined there, nullifying the already dishonest U.S. case against him by violating his client-lawyer privilege. They should be expressing outrage at Washington's maneuvers, accorded a thin veneer of due process by the British courts designed to extradite him on espionage charges for doing work that lies at the very heart of what journalism claims to be, holding the powerful to account. And he goes on to say, journalists do not need to care about Assange or like him. And, a lot of people have a lot of negative things to say about Assange. Yeah, although we talked about this in the last podcast. Yeah, Assange has his friends. I mean, he's an all right dude by some people's accounts. But anyway, they have to speak out in protest because approval of his extradition will mark the official death of journalism. This is according to Jonathan Cook. It will mean that any journalist in the world who unearths embarrassing truths about the U.S., who discovers its darkest secrets, will need to keep quiet or risk being jailed for the rest of their lives. They ought to terrify every journalist, but it has had no such effect for the reasons that I mentioned earlier about how really journalism has changed. And a lot of the talking head journalists and the kind of practice that they have, that really doesn't impact them very much, so we're not seeing much coverage on it. Well, that's pretty much what I wanted to cover today and get across, Doc. I appreciate you coming back on the podcast down there in Florida. I want to give you the last word. Anything you want to say here in closing about Assange as we appear to be, like you say, 1 week into a 4-week extradition hearing process?
Yeah, so I'm not sure how many people in the U.S. are actually paying attention to what's happening with Assange. And I will say this, that in this political climate, it would be important to pay attention to what's happening to Assange, because it has implications for everybody with respect to dissent, with respect to different kinds of viewpoints and content, and then the interpretation of actually what it is we mean by freedom of expression and what kinds of things that we're going to allow to be punished with respect to not just the press, but to all of us.
Folks, that's Dr. Jasmine McNealy. She's kind of the podcast by George expert on the Assange trial and the extradition hearing going on in London. She's following that down there in Florida, where she's with the University of Florida's College of Journalism and Communications. And I just, again, want to thank you, Dr. McNealy, for coming back on a podcast by George.
Thank you.
And folks, if you like that, if you like this kind of news, if you like the views that you get here, that as she mentioned, there's not a lot of coverage on this. If you appreciate seeing it here, please go to podcastbygeorge.com, pick the platform that you'd like to follow us on, subscribe on YouTube, follow us on Facebook, subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, any platform where podcasts are seen or heard. But that's going to do it for today. That's all there is. There ain't no more. That's another podcast by George.